The bride bent down to kiss the groom, and 120 people pretended not to smile. That's the part Nora Delaney would remember years later, not the vows, not the ring, but the sound of well-dressed men in a Chicago cathedral holding in a laugh. They'd come to watch two broken things get tied together. Adrian Vitale, 38 years old, head of the most feared family in Illinois, hadn't stood up once that evening. He hadn't stood up in a year. And the woman marrying him wasn't the one he'd been promised. She was the other one, the one they kept in the back of the restaurant, where the customers didn't have to look at her. Nobody in that cathedral could have told you her first name, so she bent down, because he couldn't rise, and she kissed a man in a wheelchair in front of a room full of people who despised them both. Then she whispered two words she hadn't planned on saying. Adrian Vitale looked up at her, not with disgust, not with pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been hunting for a very long time, and he said it so quietly that only she could hear it. Say that again. 6 hours later, behind a locked door, in a room where he wouldn't let her turn off the lights, the devil of Chicago finally found out exactly who he'd married, and nothing about that night went the way anyone had planned, not her family's way, and not his. If stories like this one stay with you, take a second to hit like and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It really does help this channel keep going. Now, let's rewind to 6 hours before the wedding, to where this setup began. Then send the other girl. Salvatore Barone said it without taking his eyes off his coffee cup, his voice as calm as a man deciding which coat to wear outside. 6 hours before the bride was due to walk into the church. In the breakfast room on the second floor of the Barone house in Oak Brook, Celeste had stood with her arms folded before the window for 20 minutes and said only one thing, repeating it again and again in different ways, that she wasn't going to marry that thing. "I'm not standing in front of all Chicago to marry some breathing corpse sitting in a wheelchair," she said. "People will laugh at me for the rest of my life." Salvatore set down his cup. He didn't shout. He didn't strike the table. He simply looked at his daughter for a moment, then said those words, and everyone in the room understood that the argument was over. Nora Delaney was called upstairs at 4:40 in the morning. She was in the basement, where they had given her a bed and a wardrobe, after working a late shift at the restaurant. No one explained much to her. They only told her that today she would go in her sister's place, that the dress had already been altered to fit her, and that a car would come at noon. Nora didn't ask why. She didn't ask whether anyone intended to ask what she wanted, either. After 10 years, not asking had become a reflex. The way people don't ask why the sky turns dark at night. She only nodded once, then went into the bathroom. Because it was already 4:50, and she still had work to do before sunrise. She washed her face with cold water, dried it, then took a flat tin box from the drawer. Inside were 3 thin pieces of flesh-colored silicone, molded to fit the right half of her face, each one marked with creases and puckered ridges made to resemble an old burn scar. She wiped alcohol across her skin, waited for it to dry, then spread a thin, even layer of medical adhesive from her temple down to her cheekbone. She placed the largest piece first, pressing it from the center toward the edges with her fingertips, slow and firm, making sure no air bubbles were trapped underneath. The second piece covered part of her chin. The third, the smallest, pulled the outer corner of her right eye downward by about 1/5 of an inch, just enough to throw her face out of balance. She mixed color on the back of her hand and blended it over the edges until the seams disappeared. She put on a pair of thick framed glasses, brushed out the hair she had dyed a dull brown, no one would bother looking at twice, then bent over the sink and reminded herself of the familiar number, 16 hours. The adhesive held for 16 hours. After that, it began to peel at the edges. She looked at the clock. 5:12. That meant that by 9 that night, and not a minute later, she had to be alone behind a closed door. Celeste came downstairs to find her close to noon. Her older sister entered the room, sat on the edge of the table, and studied Nora in the mirror with the satisfaction of someone inspecting merchandise she had just finished checking. "Looks good," Celeste said. "You've always been good with your hands." Nora didn't answer. Celeste tilted her head. "You're not angry with me, are you?" "No," Nora said. In one sense, it was true. Anger was a luxury that required somewhere solid to stand, and Nora had nowhere solid at all. Celeste took a sheet of paper, folded into quarters from her purse, and placed it on the vanity beside the tin box. She said nothing. She only pushed it toward her sister with 2 fingers. Nora didn't need to unfold it to know what it was. Once a month, An identical sheet was placed in exactly the same spot, and once a month it reminded her of the same thing. The memory care facility in Elmhurst, where Ruth Delaney had lived for the past 3 years, charged $4,800 a month for a private room with a window. The Barone family was listed as the payer. One phone call was all it would take, and the only old woman who had ever called Nora her daughter would be moved somewhere cheaper, farther away, darker. No one in this house had ever said that aloud. They didn't need to. "I've already signed off on this month," Celeste said gently, "so you can go without worrying." Then she stood, walked toward the door, and stopped. She turned back with a dark glass bottle in her hand, an old Amaro with a stained label and a cork sealed in red wax. She placed it in her sister's hand and held on to Nora's fingers for 1 beat longer than necessary. "A wedding gift from the family," Celeste said. "Pour your husband a glass before midnight. It's tradition." Nora looked down at the bottle. "What tradition?" "Ours," Celeste said. "You pour a glass, let him drink first, then you drink after him. People in this family have done it since grandfather's time." She smiled, a warm, beautiful smile, the same smile all of Chicago saw in newspaper photographs. "Just remember, before midnight. After midnight, it doesn't count anymore." Nora said yes. She put the bottle in her bag. She didn't ask why she had never once heard anyone mention such an old family tradition in all the 10 years she had lived in that house. She didn't ask why her sister had held her hand 1 beat too long, either. At noon, the car arrived. Nora stepped outside with the bag over her shoulder, carrying on half her face a burn scar that had never existed, and went to the church to marry the most feared man in the state of Illinois in her sister's place. The Vitale estate stood in Lake Forest, about 1 mile from Lake Michigan, and by the time the convoy turned onto the road leading up to the house, the sky had already begun to darken. Nora sat in the back seat beside the folded wheelchair secured tightly in the rear compartment, counting the hours in her head. 3 hours and 40 minutes left. They brought her in through the main entrance, and she understood at once that this evening would be nothing like a wedding reception. The guests stood in small clusters, glasses held at chest level, and when she passed them, the conversations didn't stop. They merely dropped to half volume, the way people lower their voices when they want someone to know they're being talked about. There were 2 things amusing them that evening, and both had been placed side by side in the middle of the room: a man who couldn't stand, and a woman they didn't want to look at for more than 2 seconds. Nora stood beside her husband, one hand resting on the arm of his chair because she didn't know where else to put it, and listened. It was the one skill 10 years of waiting tables had taught her, that people spoke freely in front of someone they considered too insignificant to matter. 2 middle-aged men stood about 4 steps away with their backs to her, and one of them said this couldn't be allowed to drag on through another winter. The other asked who would be the one to step forward. The first man said everyone already knew the answer to that. No one simply wanted to say it aloud yet. Then both men fell silent when someone approached. The man who came toward them was Vincent Rourke. He was about 45, solidly built, and he was the first person all evening to look directly at Nora's face without turning away. "Mrs. Vitale," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "I've worked for this family for 20 years, since his father's time, then his brother's. If you need anything, you come to me. Don't hesitate." Nora thanked him. He kept hold of her hand a moment longer. "He's a good man," Vincent said, tipping his chin slightly toward Adrian. "I hope you understand that. What happened last year wasn't something anyone wanted." Then he lowered his voice, the same warm smile still resting on his face. "Only thing is, the other families are getting impatient. Some people have started talking about putting it to a vote. I'm trying to shut that down, but you're his wife now, so you ought to know it's happening." He gave her hand a gentle pat and walked away. Nora turned toward Adrian and saw that he was watching Vincent leave, his expression unchanged. About half an hour later, a guest standing near the liquor table said something just loudly enough to be heard. He said the Barone family certainly knew how to bargain, and that if he were paying that much, he would at least expect to choose which daughter he got. A few people laughed. Nora didn't move. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things last longer. Adrian didn't turn his head immediately. He let the remark sit in the air for about 3 seconds, then rotated his chair toward the man and said something very quietly. 2 short sentences, so softly that even someone standing 2 steps away couldn't make out the words. Nora caught only the final word, and it was a name. The guest went rigid. The blood drained from his face so quickly that Nora thought he might fall. He set his glass down, murmured something that never quite became words, then turned away. Less than 5 minutes later, Nora looked through the window and saw his car rolling down the drive. No one in the room said anything more for the rest of the evening, and that was when Nora understood that people weren't afraid of this man because of his legs. They were afraid of him because he never needed to raise his voice. Near 10 o'clock, after most of the guests had gone, Adrian told Tommy Seraphin to wheel him into the hallway. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and waited until only the two of them remained. "How much did you hear?" he asked. Nora considered her answer for a moment, then told the truth. "Enough to know someone wants to replace you." Adrian nodded, showing no surprise. "This marriage was proposed by my side," he said, "not yours. I need you to know that, because sooner or later someone will tell you otherwise." Nora didn't understand what he meant, and she didn't have the strength to ask. She only looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was already 10:15, more than an hour past her deadline. She felt a small itch at the edge of her right temple, where the adhesive had begun to loosen. "I'm tired," she said. "I know," Adrian replied. Then he said the final words of that evening, in the same low voice he had used with the other guest. Only this time there was nothing threatening in it. "In this house, you'll be safe. That isn't affection. It's obligation. I keep my word." He turned his chair toward the elevator at the far end of the hallway. "Your room is upstairs. I'll come up 10 minutes after you." Nora went upstairs first, and those 10 minutes were the longest 10 minutes of her life. The room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, behind a heavy wooden door, and when she closed it, she stood with her back against it for a long moment, eyes shut, calculating. 10:25. The adhesive had already gone 2 hours and 13 minutes past its limit. She raised a hand and ran her fingers along her temple, and she felt it immediately, the thin edge that had separated from her skin, soft and slick, ready to slide loose. She pressed it back down with her fingertips, hard, holding it there until her hand began to ache. It stayed for a while. Then it lifted again. She thought about hiding in the bathroom and refusing to come out until morning. She thought about saying she was sick. She had used both excuses over the past 10 years, and she knew they only bought a few hours. Exactly 10 minutes later, she heard the sound of wheels in the hallway. Then the door opened. Adrian came in alone. He pushed his own chair to the center of the room, turned around, and reached back to lock the door. The bolt slid into place with a dry click. "Why did you lock the door?" Nora asked, and she hated the sound of her own voice then, thin and higher than usual. "Because someone will be standing out there listening tonight," Adrian said. "There is always someone listening in this house. I prefer to choose what they get to hear." He didn't come closer to her. He stopped about 3 steps away, and he didn't look around the room or toward the bed. He looked at her. "Could you turn off the lights?" Nora asked. She tried to make it sound like an ordinary request, the way someone might ask for a window to be opened. "Just the ceiling light." "No. I'm not used to sleeping with the light on." "You won't have to sleep with me," Adrian said. "The bed is yours. I sleep in the chair in the study next door. There is a connecting door. That was the agreement, and I'll honor it, but I'm not turning off the light." Nora stood still. "Why?" Adrian was silent for a moment. "Because I don't live with someone I'm not allowed to see," he said. "I spent a year in a house full of people I couldn't see clearly, and it nearly got me killed. I won't do that again. Not even with you." An itch spread down along her cheekbone, and she knew the edge had slipped another 1/5 of an inch. She raised her hand. She meant to press it down again, then she stopped halfway. Something inside her had simply run out of power. It wasn't courage. It was exhaustion. She had been wearing the disguise since 4:50 that morning, had spent 6 hours standing beneath the eyes of 120 people, and she no longer had the strength to hold in place something that wanted to fall. "I need you to stay still," she said. "I'm sitting," Adrian said. "Then sit still." She turned away and walked a few steps to the vanity, and she did it with her back to him. She removed her glasses and set them on the table. She slipped a fingernail beneath the edge of the silicone at her temple where it had already begun to peel, and pulled. It came away with the faintest sound, like tape being lifted from skin. She kept pulling downward, slowly, because doing it too fast burned. The large piece came free, limp in her palm like something dead. She set it on the table, then the second piece at her chin, then the final one at the corner of her eye, the smallest piece, the one that had pulled her entire face out of balance for 10 years. She dipped a cloth into the glass of water on the table and wiped away the color, carefully, twice, until her skin was completely clean. Then she straightened and turned around. There was no sound in the room. Adrian didn't move. He sat exactly where he had been, both hands resting on the arms of his chair, and he looked at her. Nora had imagined this moment countless times over the past 10 years, and in every version of it, the person facing her did one of three things. They stared with their mouth open, they burst out laughing, or they stepped back. Adrian did none of them. The silence stretched so long that she had to raise a hand and touch her own face to make sure she had removed everything. She could hear a clock somewhere downstairs. She could hear the wind beyond the window. She stood there beneath the ceiling light he had refused to turn off, with the face no one but her sister and her own father had seen in 10 years, and she waited. Adrian lowered his eyes for 1 second, then looked up again, and Nora saw something pass across his face that she couldn't read at all. It didn't look like surprise. It didn't look like desire. It looked like a man who had just seen a bruise on a child's arm and was calculating, very quickly, who had put it there. His jaw tightened for a beat, then eased. His gaze shifted to the vanity, to the 3 pieces of silicone lying there, to the cloth stained with makeup, then back to her. When he spoke, his voice was still as low as it had been in the hallway, but something underneath it had changed completely. "Who made you do this?" Nora didn't answer that question. She turned toward the bag on the chair and finished the last thing she had been told to do that day, because it was the only thing in this room she knew how to do. She took out the bottle of Amaro, peeled away the red wax around the cork, and poured a glass. "Before midnight," she said. "My sister said it's a tradition in my family. You drink first, then I drink after you." She set the glass down on the table beside him and stepped back. The clock downstairs struck 11. Adrian looked at the glass for longer than seemed normal. Then he reached for it, and Nora realized she was holding her breath, though she didn't understand why. He didn't raise it to his mouth. He wheeled himself across the room to the small sink built into the corner and poured the entire glass down the drain. Then he turned on the faucet, let the water run for about 10 seconds, and shut it off. "A gift from your sister, I'm guessing," he said. Nora stood rooted to the floor. "What are you talking about? You tell me. In the 10 years you lived in that house, did you ever see anyone pour this stuff? Funerals, weddings, Christmas, any occasion at all?" Nora opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. She searched her memory quickly and found nothing. "No," she said. "Then it isn't a tradition," Adrian said. He set the empty glass upside down beside the sink. "I don't know for certain what's in that bottle, and I don't intend to find out. But I do know one thing. If I die tonight, in this room, then tomorrow morning they'll find 2 things, my body and you." Nora still didn't move. "Who are you in that story?" Adrian asked. "You're an outsider. No one in this organization knows your name. You're not the woman your family promised me. You're the one they pushed forward at the last minute. You brought a bottle of liquor from your own house. You're alone with me behind a locked door." He paused. "Do you think they'll wait for the police to arrive?" Nora sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs could no longer hold her. "They'll kill me right here," she said. "They'll kill you right here," Adrian replied. "And every other family will nod because it'll seem like the reasonable thing to do. Your family loses someone they never counted as a person to begin with, and I die without anyone having to answer for it." Nora looked down at her hands. Something very cold was moving through her chest, and the worst part was that none of it felt shocking. It fit. It fit everything. It fit the way her sister had held her hand 1 beat too long, fit the paper left on the vanity, fit the fact that not one person had asked whether she wanted any of this. "Then why did you still marry me?" she asked. "When did you know?" "I knew the moment they told me the bride had been switched," Adrian said. "Not about the bottle. I knew something was wrong." He didn't explain further, and Nora understood that he wasn't going to. He wheeled himself back toward the center of the room. "Now we speak plainly," he said. "You're here because they gave you no choice. I need a wife sitting beside me for the next 6 months, because if I send you back tomorrow, all of Chicago will understand that I'm weak, and I can't afford to be weak right now. 6 months, you play my wife in public. Inside this house, you don't have to do anything. And after 6 months, the divorce papers will already have my signature. You can take them whenever you want. A new name, complete documents, all legal. An account in your name." He looked directly at her. "And Ruth Delaney in Elmhurst will have her room paid for until her final day. By me, not by your family. That starts this month, not after 6 months." Nora lifted her head. "How do you know her name?" "Because I investigate the woman I'm about to marry," Adrian said. "Even when they switch her at the last minute." Nora was silent for a very long time. Then she said something she had never said to anyone before, because no one had ever given her the chance to set a condition. "I have one too," she said. "No one can see my face. Not the staff, not the guards, not guests. Every morning I'll put it back on, even inside the house. You're the only one who gets to know." She had already prepared herself for the next question. She had been preparing for it for 10 years, with a half answer meant to deflect and hide, and she was ready to lie. "All right," Adrian said. And then he stopped there. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask who had made her do it, even though he had asked that very question less than an hour earlier and she hadn't answered. He only nodded once, the way someone acknowledges a clause in a contract, and moved on to something else. And it was that silence where a question should have been, that empty space, that became the first thing in Nora Delaney's life that made her think she might be able to trust this man. "Let me ask you something," Adrian said as she stood to go into the bathroom. She stopped in the doorway. "At the church, when you leaned down, you said something." "I'm sorry," Nora said. "No, I want you to say it again, exactly the way you did then." Nora looked at him, confused. "I'm sorry," she said. Adrian didn't answer with a single word. He only sat there, looking at her, for a very long time. The first 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Nora learned very quickly. At 4:50 every morning, she woke in the second-floor room, locked the bathroom door, and repeated exactly what she had been doing for the past 10 years. Alcohol. Wait for it to dry. Adhesive. 3 pieces. Press from the center outward toward the edges. Then the glasses. Then the hair. By 6 o'clock, she had become the woman everyone in the house believed they were living with. She went down to the kitchen at 7, and the cook greeted her by looking down at his pan. She walked through the hallway, and the 2 housekeepers stepped aside, their heads lowered more than necessary. No one was rude to her. No one said anything cruel. People simply arranged themselves so they wouldn't have to look directly at her for more than a second. And Nora found it so familiar that it was almost comforting. At the Barone family restaurant, people had done exactly the same thing. At night, she sat in her room and waited until the entire floor had gone quiet before removing the face. Adrian kept his end of the agreement. He slept in the study next door, the connecting door always closed, and not once did he cross through it without knocking. During those 3 weeks, Nora began noticing things she didn't have names for. The first person she paid attention to was Tommy Seraphin, the driver and bodyguard, about 34 years old, the only person in the house who greeted her by name every morning. He was kind, opened the car door for her, asked whether she was cold, but when she asked him about Adrian's schedule for the day, Tommy only smiled and said the boss would tell her himself if the boss wanted her to know. He said it so pleasantly that it took Nora a moment to realize she had just been refused. The second thing involved physical therapy. At breakfast, during the second week, one of the housekeepers casually remarked to the other that it was Tuesday and wondered whether the therapist would be coming that day. The other said she had never seen anyone come at all. Both of them fell silent the moment they noticed Nora standing in the doorway. Nora remembered that at Elmhurst, Ruth had therapy 3 times a week, and that was only an ordinary care facility. The third thing happened one afternoon, when Adrian asked her to hand him a pen. She placed it in his hand, and her fingers brushed across his palm. The skin there had hardened into 2 rough bands, but not where Nora expected. She had pushed Ruth's wheelchair for 3 years, and she knew where wheelchair calluses formed, on the pad below the thumb and along the inner edge of the hand where it met the wheel rim. Adrian's calluses ran across the upper part of his palms, beneath the base of his fingers. She pulled her hand away and said nothing. The fourth thing was the room in the basement. She discovered it while looking for the circuit breaker during a partial power outage in the east wing one evening. At the far end of the basement corridor stood a steel door unlike any other door in the house, fitted with a magnetic lock and a numeric keypad. She stood there for about 5 seconds, then turned around. She didn't try it. Nora wasn't the kind of person who tested doors in someone else's home. But the next morning, as she passed the top of the basement stairs, she saw Tommy standing there, doing nothing at all, just standing, and he greeted her by name as he always did. The fifth thing was the doctor. Her name was Helen Kessler, about 52 years old, and Nora saw her for the first time at 12:20 in the morning when she went downstairs to the kitchen for water. Her car was parked by the rear entrance. She carried a hard-sided case, went straight upstairs to the second floor, stayed for about 40 minutes, then left. The second time was at 12:30 in the morning. The third was close to 1 o'clock. Never once during the day. Nora stood at the foot of the stairs in the darkness and told herself that private doctors probably worked around their patients' schedules, that there was nothing strange about it, and then she went back upstairs. That night she lay awake for a long time, not because she had figured anything out, but because something in the house felt wrong. Like a picture hanging 1/5 of an inch crooked, something the eye noticed before the mind understood why. She told no one. She didn't arrange any of it into a pattern. She simply stored each thing away the same way she had stored everything for the past 10 years. Quietly, without comment, saving it for later. On Monday morning of the 4th week, while she was pressing the second silicone piece onto her chin, the doorbell rang downstairs. She heard voices, then the sound of heels climbing the staircase, steady and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew with absolute certainty that she would be welcomed wherever she went. Nora froze with one hand halfway raised, a piece of silicone still resting against her fingertips. She knew those footsteps. She had lived with them for 10 years. She pressed the silicone hard against her skin and reached for her glasses. Celeste was waiting for her in the small sitting room on the first floor, sitting with one leg crossed over the other. And when Nora walked in, she stood and wrapped both arms around her sister, the kind of embrace people only gave when someone else was watching. "I've missed you so much," Celeste said. "It's been 3 weeks, and I haven't stopped thinking about you. Are you all right? How are they treating you?" "Normally," Nora said. "Is he kind to you?" "He keeps his word." Celeste sat down again, pulled her sister down beside her, and took Nora's hand. "I've been worried sick," she said. "But you know, I've been thinking, and I finally understand something. Everyone in our family is good at talking. You're the only one who actually gets things done. You've always been the most useful one in the family." She squeezed Nora's hand once. "Father says so too." Nora sat still and let her sister hold her hand, answering each question in 3 or 4 words, exactly the way she had for 10 years. Celeste asked about Adrian's health, asked how he got around, asked whether there were many people in the house, asked whether he often went out at night. Nora answered that she didn't know. Close to 11 o'clock, Celeste said she needed to make a phone call and asked to step outside for some air. Nora stayed a little longer, then went into the west hallway on her way back to her room, and that was why she passed the conservatory at the far end of the wing. A glass room built directly onto the corridor, its door standing open about the width of a hand. She heard Vincent Rourke's voice first. "You can't come here like this." "You told me that yourself, Vincent." "I know," Celeste said. "You haven't said a word to me in 3 weeks. Because there hasn't been anything to say." "Nothing to say," Celeste repeated. "Vincent, he's still alive. They're both still alive. Do you understand what that means?" Nora stopped. She stood about 3 steps from the door, in the shadow of the hallway, and didn't move forward. "Someone poured it out," Vincent said. "Then we do it another way." "There isn't another way we can do in 3 weeks, Celeste. I told you. That night was the only night. Only that night had everything lined up at once. A locked door, a bride no one knew by sight, and a bottle brought over from your house. People walk in, find him lying there, find the girl standing there, and the whole thing is finished in 5 minutes. No one investigates a crime when the culprit is already standing in the room. So what now? Now I have to take another route, and the other route is slower. A vote. One family at a time. It'll take a few months." There was the sound of footsteps moving through the conservatory. "My father won't wait a few months," Celeste said. "He's already waited a year." "Then tell your father I've waited a year too." There was silence for a moment. Then Celeste's voice changed, dropping lower, becoming softer. "Do you know I almost had to be the one standing there? In that room? If I'd gone through with the marriage, I would have been the one dragged out into the yard that night. Did you ever think about that, Vincent? Even for 1 second? You took care of yourself, didn't you?" "I took care of myself," Celeste said. "I told Father I wasn't marrying a breathing corpse, and Father sent the other girl in my place. It was that simple." She waited tables for us for 10 years, wore that face for 10 years, and never argued with me once. She's the only person in my family I could put in there without losing anything at all." "You make it sound easy." "You think I enjoyed it?" Celeste said. "Then tell me, who was I supposed to send? You wanted me to go?" No answer came. "I even put the bottle in her hand myself," Celeste said. "I told her to pour it before midnight, and she said yes." She didn't ask a single question. She's never asked a single question in her entire life. Nora stood there. She could hear the air conditioning running somewhere above her. She could hear her own breathing, steady, slower than she would have expected. She looked down at her right hand, the hand that had held that bottle all afternoon on her wedding day, and waited for it to tremble. It didn't. "Go home," Vincent said. "Use the back door. I'll leave first." Nora turned and walked away. She walked normally, no faster and no slower, down the hallway, up the stairs, back to her room, and closed the door behind her. She stood before the mirror, took off her glasses, and placed them on the table. She looked at the face wearing a burn that had never existed, and thought about the one thing her sister had said correctly in that entire conversation. She has never asked a single question in her entire life. Nora put her glasses back on. At lunch that day, she went downstairs and ate with Adrian as usual, sitting in the same chair, and she didn't say a single word to him about the conservatory. He asked how her morning had been. She said normal. He looked at her for one beat longer than usual, then didn't ask again. She waited 2 days. Not to gather courage, but to think clearly, because she knew she would only get one chance to say it. On Thursday night, while Adrian was in his study, she knocked on the door and walked in without waiting for him to tell her to enter. "I have something to say," she said. Adrian closed the folder in front of him and turned his chair toward her. "Go ahead." "You need to know what's happening inside the Barone house," Nora said. "You have your own people, I know that. But your people can only stand outside the gates." She stood straight, her arms resting at her sides. "I can't. I know that house. I know where my father keeps his papers, what time he leaves his study, who is allowed onto the 3rd floor and who isn't. I know which door has no alarm because it's been broken for 3 years, and no one has bothered to fix it. I waited tables in that restaurant for 10 years, and in all those 10 years, not one guest ever looked closely at my face for more than 2 seconds. Adrian said nothing. "People talk freely in front of a server," she continued. "They make plans while I'm pouring water. I can go back there. I have a perfectly reasonable excuse to visit home. No one suspects someone like me." "No," Adrian said. "You haven't heard all of it." "I've heard enough." He spoke in that familiar, low voice, but this time there was nothing beneath it. "You're not one of my people. You're a clause in a 6-month agreement. Clauses don't go to work." Nora stood still. She had prepared herself to be refused, but she had prepared for an argument, not for a door being slammed shut. And then she did the thing she would think about over and over on many nights afterward, the thing she should have stopped herself from doing before the words ever left her mouth. She kept talking. "There's something else," she said. Her voice remained steady. "You said 6 months. I want to tell you that I don't want 6 months." Adrian didn't move. "I've been here 3 weeks, Nora said. "In those 3 weeks, you're the only person in my entire life who has ever allowed me to set a condition. You didn't ask me why. You didn't make me explain myself. You paid for Ruth without waiting for me to beg." She drew in a breath. "I know I was pushed here in someone else's place. I know I'm not the woman you chose. But I want this marriage to be real, not 6 months. Real." She finished speaking, and stood there in the brightly lit room, her face still covered beneath the adhesive she had put on that morning, and waited. Adrian looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. "No," he said. Nora waited for the rest. There was no rest. "You don't have anything else to say?" "No. Even one sentence would be enough." "I've already answered you," Adrian said. Then he turned his chair back toward the desk, opened the folder, and picked up his pen. "It's late. Go back to your room." Nora remained there for one more beat, then walked out and closed the door behind her. She returned to her room, locked the door, and removed the face in front of the mirror as she did every night. She did it very slowly. The strangest thing was that she didn't cry. She had cried when she was 17, and they told her that from then on, she would have to wear this face, and she had long ago used up all the tears she had for that. What she felt that night wasn't sadness. It was something hot and sour that ran from her throat down into her stomach, and she knew its name: shame. At the church on her wedding day, 120 people had laughed at her, but none of them had asked what she wanted, and there was no shame in something you had never chosen for yourself. But tonight she had stood up on her own, walked into that room on her own, and offered herself with both hands, and he had handed her back with a single word. For the next 3 days, the house was quiet. Adrian didn't come down for breakfast. He sent word through Tommy that he had business in the city and would be home late. On the second day, they sat at the same dinner table and said nothing, except a few words about the weather. By the third day, Nora realized that he no longer looked at her. Before that, he had always looked straight at her whenever they spoke, even when she was wearing the adhesive and silicone on her face. And that had been the one thing in this house that made her feel as though she truly existed. For 3 days now, he spoke to his plate, to the window, to the papers in his hands. And Nora, who had spent 10 years reading every shift in another person's expression when they looked at her, had only one way to understand it. She thought, so he's just like the others after all. He's only better at hiding it. He lasted exactly 3 weeks. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke at 4:50 and put the face back on. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt relieved while doing it. On the 6th day, Adrian spoke to her for the first time. He waited for her at the foot of the stairs and told her that on Saturday there would be the annual fundraising gala at the Drake Hotel for the scholarship foundation named after his father, and that she had to attend with him. "It's part of the agreement," he said. "I know," Nora replied. Neither of them said another word during the entire drive into the city. The second-floor ballroom at the Drake held about 200 people that night, and Nora understood immediately that this was the kind of place where 2 different worlds stood on the same floor. There were 3 city council members. There were 2 people she had seen on the front page of the Tribune, and there were others, people in expensive suits who held each other's hands a little too long when they shook them, people whose names never appeared anywhere at all. Salvatore Barone arrived at 8 o'clock. He passed his daughter, gave her a single nod, and didn't stop. Nora stood beside Adrian's wheelchair for 2 hours. People came over to greet them, and this time they looked at her, because she was no longer the last-minute replacement bride. She was Mrs. Vitali, and people were required to greet Mrs. Vitali. She noticed that whenever someone approached, Adrian shifted his chair slightly to the left, just enough for her to stand in the open space on his right, out of the direct line of sight from the entrance. She didn't think much of it at the time. Near 10 o'clock, after the speeches were over, and people had gathered into small groups, Vincent Rourke approached. He carried 2 glasses of water, handed one to Nora, then stood beside Adrian's wheelchair facing the crowd, in a position where perhaps 20 people nearby could hear him. "Adrian," he said, his voice still as warm as it had been on the wedding day, "I have to say this in front of everyone, because if I say it privately, it'll look like I'm going behind your back." Adrian didn't answer. The conversations in the nearby groups gradually fell silent. "It's been a year," Vincent said. 1 year where the 3 families on the other side haven't been able to sign a single thing with us. The port is stalled. The union people keep asking me the same question, and I can't answer it. They ask who is sitting at the head of the table. He turned toward Adrian, and his voice lowered, filled with regret. "I've served this family for 20 years. I worked for your father, then your brother. I don't want to say this, but I think it's time for the families to sit down and vote." No one said anything. Nora saw several people lower their eyes to the floor, and she understood that the ones looking down were the ones who had already known. Salvatore Barone spoke from behind them without bothering to step closer. "Vincent is right," he said. "No one here wants to insult anybody, but business is still business. My family married one of my daughters into that house, and I have a right to ask who exactly I'm tied to." He gave a small shrug. "A vote is perfectly normal. If he wins, then everything only becomes clearer." Nora looked at Adrian. He sat still, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, and he didn't look as though he was about to speak. She realized he wasn't going to. She also realized that if he did, it wouldn't help, because anything he said now would sound like a man defending himself. So she spoke instead. "Mr. Rourke," she said. The entire group turned toward her. "You just said you couldn't answer the union's question." "That's right, ma'am. But you just asked that same question here, in front of 200 people, in the middle of a scholarship fundraiser named after my husband's father," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud. She had learned from Adrian that it didn't need to be. If you were truly worried about business, you would have asked it behind closed doors. People ask questions in public when they don't need an answer. They need an audience. Someone nearby drew in a breath. Vincent smiled, but the smile came half a beat too late. You're absolutely right, and I apologize. There's one more thing, Nora said, turning toward Salvatore. You said you have the right to ask who you're tied to. Then ask me. I'm the one who lives in that house. Salvatore looked at his daughter, and for 2 seconds Nora saw something pass across his face that she had never seen in 10 years. He didn't know how to answer a person he had never counted as a person at all. It's late, he said, then turned away. The group slowly began to break apart. Vincent excused himself and disappeared toward the bar on the other side of the room. Nora remained where she was, still holding the glass of water he had given her, and she noticed that her hand felt slightly warm. Adrian said nothing to her about what had just happened. He only spoke one sentence, very quietly. We're leaving in 10 minutes. Just then, people began heading out, and the flow of guests crowded toward the main doors. Nora watched them, and she noticed a server moving against the current. He wasn't carrying a tray. He was coming in from the direction of the doors, slipping through the people who were leaving, and his eyes weren't looking toward any of the tables. Nora watched him for about 3 seconds. Then someone came over to greet her, and she turned away. The woman who came over to greet her was the wife of some lawyer, and she had barely spoken 2 sentences before Nora stopped hearing her. Nora was looking over the woman's shoulder toward the far end of the ballroom, where the server from earlier had stopped. He was standing beside a column, facing in their direction, and his right hand was inside his jacket pocket. Nora didn't have time to understand what that meant. She only had time to open her mouth. Adrian caught her wrist before she could make a sound. He yanked hard, pulling her downward so sharply that her whole body pitched forward, and at the same instant, he spun his chair at an angle, putting himself between her and the far end of the room. Then the ballroom exploded with noise. Not one sound. 3 of them, very close together, dry and flat. Nothing like the gunshots Nora had ever heard in movies. Then came the crash of breaking glasses, tables overturning, 200 people screaming at once and running in the same direction. Someone kicked her in the back as they rushed past. A tray hit the floor about 1.5 feet from her head. Nora lay face down on the floor, and for the first 3 seconds she didn't know where she was. She only knew there was a weight pressing across her left shoulder, and that weight was Adrian. She pushed him away and sat up. He had fallen out of the chair. The wheelchair lay on its side several feet away, one wheel still spinning. Adrian was lying on his side on the floor, his eyes open, trying to say something. Nora looked down at her hands and saw that they were wet. "You've been shot," she said. She heard her own voice as though it were coming from very far away. Somewhere, someone was shouting for security. Footsteps thundered toward the doors. No one came toward them. For 6 seconds, in a room filled with 200 people, Nora Delaney was the only person who remained beside her husband where he lay. She looked around and saw a stone column about 4 steps away, on the side where a wall blocked the line of sight from the far end of the ballroom. She slid both arms beneath Adrian's armpits and pulled. He was much heavier than she expected. She dragged him half a step, lost her grip, then pulled again. Her knees slid across broken glass, and she felt nothing. "Can you give me a hand here?" she said through clenched teeth, and the strange thing was that he could. He braced one elbow against the floor and pushed, and together they managed to crawl the rest of the way. Nora dragged him behind the column and propped his back against it. Then she did the things her hands remembered even though her mind didn't. She ripped down the nearest tablecloth, grabbed the thickest section, folded it into quarters, and pressed it down. She leaned into it with all her weight, both hands stacked one over the other, elbows straight, exactly the way they had taught her in the mandatory first aid class the restaurant required every employee to take. Adrian made a sound. "Don't talk," she said. She shouted for Tommy twice and heard him answer from near the doors. She could hear sirens in the distance. Somewhere out on Walton Street, she didn't lift her hands. The pressure beneath her palms was beginning to soften. Adrian's eyes started to drift, not closing, simply failing to settle on anything anymore. He was staring at the ceiling. "Look at me," Nora said. He didn't. She lifted one hand, caught his chin, and turned his face toward her, while keeping pressure down with the other. "Look at me." His eyelids sagged halfway shut, and then the words came out of her mouth before she had time to think, in exactly the same voice she used in the restaurant kitchen at 2 in the morning. The blunt, exhausted voice of someone who had been working for 12 straight hours and didn't have time for this. "Hey, don't die on my shift." Something happened to Adrian Vital's face. His eyes, which had been drifting, suddenly stopped. They fixed on her face and stayed there. His pupils widened, then tightened. He looked at her not like a man asking for help, not like a man in pain. He looked at her like someone who had just heard a voice calling from very far away and was trying to decide whether he had imagined it. His lips moved. He managed 3 words, barely more than breath, and Nora had to bend close to hear them. "Say it again." "What?" "That sentence," he said. "Say it again." Nora didn't understand any of it. She thought he was delirious. She thought people said strange things when they were losing blood, and the important thing was to keep him conscious, so she repeated it. "Don't die on my shift." Adrian kept looking at her. He didn't blink, and for the 2 seconds before Tommy Seraphin came rushing over and dropped to his knees beside them, for the 2 seconds before the entire ballroom closed in around them, the man all of Chicago called the devil lay there beneath the hands of a woman wearing a face that wasn't her own, staring at her with the eyes of someone who had just found the thing he had been searching for all year. They didn't take him to a hospital. Tommy drove straight north to a 2-story house in Kenosha that Nora had never heard of, and Dr. Helen Kessler was already waiting there with 2 assistants. Nora was pushed out of the room close to midnight and sat in the hallway until 4 in the morning, both hands still stiff with dried blood, and no one told her to go wash them. By morning, Dr. Kessler came out and said the bullet hadn't struck anything that couldn't be repaired, that he had lost a great deal of blood, and that the next 24 hours would determine whether a fever set in. Nora asked if she needed someone to stay on watch. The doctor looked at her for a moment and said yes. Nora didn't leave that room for 2 days. She took his temperature every 4 hours and wrote it down on a sheet of paper. She changed the cloth on his forehead. She fell asleep in the chair and woke to the sound of him talking in his sleep. She didn't neglect her own routine either. At 4:50 every morning, she went into the bathroom, locked the door, and put the face back on. On the second night, Nora woke close to 2 o'clock because she heard movement in the room. She opened her eyes and saw the bed empty. Adrian was standing. He stood in the middle of the room with one hand braced on the back of the chair, his body tilted slightly to the left to avoid the bandaged area, and he was walking. 3 steps to the door. He locked the bolt, tested the handle once, then turned around. It wasn't the turn of a man who had only just managed to get back on his feet. It was the turn of a man who moved that way every day. He saw her sitting in the chair with her eyes open. Neither of them said anything for a very long time. "Sit down," Nora finally said, "before you tear the stitches." Adrian walked 3 steps back to the bed and sat on the edge. He didn't hurry. He didn't try to explain either. "How long?" she asked. 11 months. "Since you were shot last year?" 3 weeks after that, he said. "For the first 3 weeks, I truly couldn't walk. After that, I could. I decided no one was going to know. Who knows? Helen Kessler, Tommy Seraphin." He paused. "Now you." Nora sat still. In her mind, everything began sliding into its proper place on its own, so quickly it almost made her dizzy. The therapist who had never come, the calluses in the wrong place on his palms, the doctor who came at midnight instead of during normal hours, the steel door in the basement, the way he shifted his chair whenever a stranger came near, putting Nora in the blind spot. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Because the man who shot me last year was someone inside my own house," Adrian said. "Not an outsider. An outsider wouldn't know which route I took, what time I moved, which door I used. There were 4 people who could have known that. If I recovered, all 4 would stay quiet and wait for another chance. If I was paralyzed, one of the 4 would start moving around, meeting people, counting votes." He looked down at his hands. People don't show their true faces in front of a strong man. They only show them in front of an empty chair. Nora stood. She stood there in the middle of the room and felt something rising in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 10 years. "Do you know how many people were at that wedding?" she said. 120. "You counted?" Tommy did. 120 people, Nora said. "I had to bend down in front of 120 people because you couldn't stand. I stood there listening to them hold back their laughter. I knew exactly what they were laughing at because I'd lived with that for 10 years already. And from beginning to end, you sat in that chair while you could have stood up." Adrian didn't move. "You let 100 people laugh in my face at our own wedding," she said, "just so your trap would stay intact." "Yes, he said. Nora waited. She waited for the word but. She waited for an explanation. Something about how he had no choice, that he had considered what it would do to her, that he was sorry. You don't have anything else to say? Everything you said is true, Adrian replied. Anything I add would only be to make me feel better, not you. Nora turned her face away. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him. 3 weeks ago, I walked into your study and told you I wanted this marriage to be real, she said. You answered me with one word. Then for 3 straight days, you wouldn't look at me. I remember. You could already walk then. Yes. So what have you been for the past 3 weeks? Nora asked. My husband? Or was I just another part of your plan? Adrian was silent for a long time. Both, he said. Nora nodded slowly, still looking out into the darkness beyond the window. You know what's funny? She said. In that house, for 10 years, I was the only person who was never allowed to know what was happening. I thought I'd gotten out. She picked up her coat. Your bandage needs changing at 6. I'll call Dr. Kessler. Nora. She stopped at the door but didn't turn around. That thing you said at the Drake, Adrian said, when I was lying on the floor. You were delirious. No, he said. I was more awake than I've been all year. Nora opened the door and walked out. Nora slept for 4 hours in the room at the end of the hallway, and when she returned close to noon, Adrian was sitting propped against the pillows, fully awake, and he told her to close the door. Sit down, he said. I owe you something, and if I wait any longer, I'll find a reason not to say it. Nora sat in the chair. Last September, Adrian began, I went to your father's restaurant in the West Loop. There was a meeting about the port. I came in through the back entrance, crossed the kitchen, and made it to the bar out front. He spoke slowly and evenly, without adding a single adjective, in the voice of a man who had replayed the story in his own mind so many times that the edges had worn smooth. The lights went out first. The whole block lost power, not just the restaurant, so no one thought anything of it at the time. I was standing about 2 steps from the bar when I was shot. I fell backward behind the bar, and I stayed there. Nora sat perfectly still. In complete darkness, he said. There were no emergency lights in that section. Everyone ran toward the front entrance. I heard people step past my head at least 3 times, and no one stopped. I was lying on my back, looking up at the ceiling, and I couldn't move. He paused for a beat. Then someone came. That person knelt behind my head, not beside me, behind me. People do that when they want to put their full weight into the pressure without having to reach. Nora didn't move. They took something, probably a napkin, folded it, and pressed down, hard, both hands stacked on top of each other. I know it was both hands because I could feel it. Adrian looked directly at her. I lay there for about 4 minutes. I couldn't see anything. There was no light, and that person stayed behind my head, outside my line of sight from beginning to end. I didn't know whether they were tall or short, old or young, what they were wearing. I heard only one sentence. He didn't repeat the sentence. He didn't need to. By the time the ambulance arrived, that person was gone, he said. I questioned everyone who had been there that night. Your father said there had been no one, said I must have crawled out on my own. The manager said all the employees had run. I had my people check the shift roster, and they gave me a list with a name missing. Nora closed her eyes. I searched for 11 months, Adrian said. I wasn't looking for a face because I didn't have one to look for. I was looking for a voice. Do you know how hard it is to find a voice in this city? Of course, you spoke to me every day in this house, but you used the tone of survival, soft, flat, almost robotic, that hid the raw, commanding edge I heard that night in the dark. It wasn't until you shouted at me to not die on your shift at the Drake that the mask of the servant finally cracked, and the voice underneath the one that had saved my life was laid bare. Nora opened her eyes. This marriage, she said. I was the one who proposed it, Adrian replied. Not your father. I sent people to speak with him back in March. I needed a foothold inside that house, a legitimate reason for my people to come and go, so I could ask questions I couldn't ask from outside. They promised me Celeste Barone. He gave a slight shrug. Then on the morning of the wedding, they told me the bride had been changed. No explanation. Replaced with a daughter no one in my organization had ever even heard of. And you still agreed. I agreed immediately, Adrian said. Because a family like the Barones doesn't switch brides at the last minute without a reason. And whatever that reason was, it had to be worse than making me wait another few months. I wanted to know what they were hiding. The fastest way was to step right into the middle of it. Nora sat straighter. So you didn't know anything about me? I knew your name. I knew you were Salvatore Barone's illegitimate daughter, that you came looking for him when you were 17. I knew you worked at that restaurant. He paused. I didn't know which shifts you worked. I didn't have a photograph of you. All of Chicago said you were disfigured, and I had no reason to doubt it. Then why didn't you react at all? Nora said. That night when I took the face off, you sat there and didn't say a single word, because at that point, I had only seen you, Adrian said. I hadn't heard you say that sentence yet. He leaned forward slightly. I married you because of a voice. I had no idea whether you were beautiful or ugly, and I didn't need to know. It wasn't part of my calculations for even 1 second. Nora sat in silence for a very long time. Then she said, very softly, and the night I came into your study, Adrian was quiet. You answered me with one word. Yes. Why? He didn't answer right away. Because that night, he finally said, you had just offered to go back into your father's house and spy for me, meaning you were willing to return to the same house that had sent you off to die in someone else's place 3 weeks earlier. Then 10 seconds later, you told me you wanted to stay with me. He looked at her. I sat there thinking, this person will give herself to anyone who holds out a hand. You weren't choosing me, Nora. You were looking for somewhere to surrender yourself, and I happened to be the person who had treated you best for 3 weeks. So you refused me. So I refused you. And I didn't explain, because explaining would have been just another way of keeping you there. Nora looked down at the 2 hands resting in her lap, the hands that 3 nights earlier had pressed down against his chest on the floor of the Drake Hotel, and the hands that 11 months earlier had done exactly the same thing in the darkness behind a bar. You were wrong, she said. Maybe, Adrian replied, but I still thought I was right until that night at the hotel. Dr. Kessler told him he needed 6 weeks away from Chicago, and Tommy drove them north to a cabin in Door County, Wisconsin, standing about 50 steps from the water. There were no servants, no one else except the 3 of them. On the first morning, Nora woke at 4:50 out of habit, opened the tin box, then sat staring at it for a long time. Then she closed the lid and went downstairs to the kitchen. She made coffee. She went out and sat on the back steps and drank the whole cup in the sunlight. And there was no one there to look at her, and it was the first morning in 10 years that the sun had fallen directly across her real face. By afternoon, she still hadn't put the disguise back on. By evening, she still hadn't. Tommy Seraphin saw her for the first time on the second day, at the kitchen door. He stopped for exactly half a second, then said good morning, Mrs. Vitale, exactly as he did every day, and went out to the car. He didn't ask a single question, then or at any time afterward. Adrian walked a little farther every day. On the 4th afternoon, the 2 of them walked all the way to the end of the road and back, and on the way home he told her a kind of story unlike anything he had ever told her before. At the Drake, he said, before everything happened, you saw him before I did. I saw him moving against the flow of people. That was the first thing. There were 3 others you missed. He stopped beside the fence. Whenever you enter a room, count the doors first. Every door, including the ones people don't use. Then find the one person in the room who isn't holding anything. A server is always carrying something. Guests hold glasses. The person with empty hands is the person waiting. And the third thing? The person standing with his back to the wall while everyone else has their back turned toward the room, Adrian said. There were 2 people like that night. One of them was me. Nora thought about it all evening. The next morning, she walked into the kitchen and said, before she even sat down, that the dining room window didn't have an inside latch, that the west cellar door could be opened from outside, and that the milkman on Tuesday had parked his vehicle facing the road instead of backing in the way he had the previous 2 times. Adrian set down his cup. 3 for 3, he said. That milkman is one of mine. I know, Nora said. I only wanted to see whether you'd tell me the truth. He laughed. It was the first time she had ever seen him laugh, and it lasted only about a second. She also learned something he hadn't taught her. By the end of the 2nd week, she had noticed that whenever Adrian was about to say something that wasn't entirely true, he pressed his lips together for one very brief beat, before speaking. She tested it on Friday night when he said his shoulder didn't hurt anymore. "You just pressed your lips together," she said. Adrian looked at her for a moment. "It hurts," he admitted, "but not much." "You did it again." "Fine," he said. "It hurts a lot." On Saturday evening, the two of them sat on the back steps, and he told her about his brother. "His name was Marco," Adrian said. 4 years older than me. He was the one raised for that chair, not me. When I was 22, I left, studied finance at the University of Illinois, and spent 4 years working for an investment fund on LaSalle Street. My father didn't speak to me for those entire 4 years. Then what happened? Then my father died. 3 months later, Marco was killed in something I still don't know exactly who was behind. He looked out over the water. I came back to Chicago for the funeral, and I planned to stay 2 weeks. But when I got there, 4 people inside the family were already dividing everything among themselves, and they had started dividing it before Marco was even in the ground. "So you stayed." "I stayed because I was angry," Adrian said. "That was the only reason, and it wasn't a good one. I stayed a month, then a year, then 12 years. And now I'm this." He said it without a trace of self-pity, like a man reading out the answer to a calculation. Marco probably would have done better. He liked people. I don't. "You like me," Nora said. Adrian turned and looked at her. He didn't press his lips together. "Yes," he said. Nora looked at him for another moment. Then she leaned over and kissed him. She did it decisively, without asking, without waiting, like someone who had finally been given the right to choose one thing in her own life, and had no intention of asking anyone's permission. Adrian didn't move for the first half-second. Then he raised a hand, placed it behind her head, and held her there. When they pulled apart, he said, "You know there are still 4 months left." "I know. The papers are still in the safe at home. I've already signed them." "I know," Nora said. She stood, gathered the 2 cups, and went inside. At the doorway, she stopped. "But don't press your lips together when you mention them," she said, then closed the door behind her. In the 4th week, Adrian handed her a sheet of paper over breakfast. "She's been moved," he said. 10 days ago. A place in Green Bay, about a 40-minute drive from here. Her room has a window overlooking the garden, and there's 1 nurse for every 4 residents, instead of 1 for 12. Nora took the paper and couldn't speak for a while. "You didn't ask me. If I'd asked, you would have said it wasn't necessary," Adrian replied. "You always say that." They went that afternoon. Nora stayed in the car for another 4 minutes after Tommy had shut off the engine. She had planned to bring the tin box with her. She had put it in her bag that morning, then taken it out, then put it back in again, and in the end she had left it on the table at the house. For the past 3 years, every time she had visited her foster mother, she had worn the other face. Ruth was sitting beside the window in the common room, her hands resting in her lap. The old woman looked up as Nora walked in and gave the polite smile people gave to strangers. "Hello," Ruth said. "Who are you here to visit?" "I'm here to visit you, Mom," Nora said. She pulled a chair over and sat beside her. "Have you eaten anything today?" Ruth looked out the window and said there had been a bird sitting out there all morning, that it kept coming back again and again, that she didn't know what it was looking for. Then she asked whether Nora was the new nurse. Nora said she wasn't. Ruth nodded and went back to looking out the window. Nora sat there for 40 minutes. She talked about the weather. She said this room was brighter than the old one. She held the old woman's hand, and Ruth let her hold it the way someone allows a kind stranger to hold their hand. When it was almost time to leave, Nora bent down to retie her shoelace, and when she straightened again, Ruth was looking at her, looking directly at her. The old woman lifted one hand and touched Nora's right cheek. That place, the place where for 3 years she had only been allowed to see something else. Her fingers trembled. "There you are," Ruth said. "There's my girl. I always knew you'd stop hiding someday." Nora couldn't say anything. The old woman patted her cheek twice, then her hand slipped back into her lap, and she turned her head toward the window again. "That bird is still out there," Ruth said. On the drive home, Nora talked for 20 minutes, and Adrian didn't interrupt her once. She told him that her biological mother had left Chicago before Nora was old enough to walk, taking her and leaving the other child behind, and that she died in Rockford when Nora was 4. She told him about 3 different foster homes in Winnebago County, and then about the 4th, Ruth Delaney's home, where she stayed for 13 years. She told him that when she was 17, A black car pulled up in front of the house, and a man stepped out and said he was her father. She told him about the room on the 3rd floor of the Barone house, where Celeste had stared at her for an entire afternoon, before telling their father that the two of them couldn't be allowed to have the same face, that people would ask questions, that the whole city would ask questions. She told him about the special effects artist the Barone family had hired from a film studio in Los Angeles, the man who had taken a mold of her face and created 3 silicone pieces, and about the story of the fire that the Barones spread afterward. She told him that for the first 2 years, she had believed the arrangement was temporary. Then I stopped believing that, she said, and everything became much easier after that. Adrian looked out the car window for a long time. It isn't her face, he finally said. She just happened to have it 11 minutes before you did. Adrian's phone vibrated close to 9 that evening, after they had returned to the house. He looked at the screen for 1 second, then answered. He said exactly 4 sentences during the entire call, and Nora heard every one of them. He said, "I'm listening." He said, "What day?" He said, "Where?" Then he said, "All right, I'll be there." He put the phone down on the table. "Vincent," he said, "the families have agreed to sit down together next Thursday." "Where?" Adrian didn't answer immediately, and Nora knew the answer before he said it. "Your father's restaurant," he said. "West Loop." Nora rose from her chair. "They chose that place for a reason. Of course they did. They want me pushed in through the exact same door I couldn't walk out of on my own a year ago." He said it calmly, almost with satisfaction. "I need that. The more people there, the better. The more witnesses there are, the harder it'll be for anyone to take back their word afterward." "How are you planning to go in?" "In the wheelchair," Adrian said. "Until I don't need it anymore." He stood and walked to the window. "One more thing. That day, you stay home." Nora didn't answer. "Nora, you heard me," she said. "I didn't say anything." On Wednesday, one day before the meeting, Nora told Tommy to drive her back to Chicago. She said she needed to pick up some things from the Lake Forest estate. Tommy watched her through the rearview mirror for the first 20 miles, then stopped looking. At 4 in the afternoon, she told him to pull over in Oak Brook, 2 blocks from the Barone house. "You shouldn't get out here," Tommy said. "Wait for me here for 40 minutes, Nora replied. "If I'm not back in 40 minutes, call him." She had spent the entire morning becoming her sister. There was no adhesive at all, and that was the funny part. All she had to do was take off her glasses, let her hair down, line her eyes exactly the way Celeste always did, and put on the same kind of coat. She had watched that woman for 10 years. She knew Celeste walked heel first, knew she carried her phone in her left hand, knew she never greeted the gatekeeper. Nora walked through the side gate at 4:12 and didn't greet the gatekeeper. He nodded and pressed the button to let her through. Inside the house, a television was playing in the living room. One of the housekeepers crossed the foot of the stairs, saw her, and said, "Miss Celeste, you're home early," without stopping. Nora didn't answer. She went straight up to the 2nd floor, turned left, and stopped outside Salvatore Barone's study. She stood there for 3 seconds and listened. There was no sound inside. She opened the door and stepped in. 4:16. She had 14 minutes before her father came upstairs, because in all 10 years she had lived in that house, he always went to his study at 4:30. Never earlier, never later, even on holidays. The ledger was in the 2nd drawer of the filing cabinet, unlocked, because Salvatore Barone had never imagined that anyone inside his own house would dare open it. Nora knew which drawer, because she had carried coffee into this room for 4 straight years. She flipped through it and photographed every page with her phone, 23 pages, her hands perfectly steady. 4:24. Then, she opened the bottom desk drawer and found the second thing, an old handheld recorder, the kind that used a memory card. She knew it existed because she had seen it running while her father spoke with other people in this room, and she had understood since she was 19 that he recorded every meeting, even meetings with his own people, especially meetings with his own people. She pulled out the memory card and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. 4:27. She closed the drawer and turned toward the door. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, slow, with the tip of a cane striking each wooden step. 3 minutes early. Nora stepped back and pressed herself into the narrow space behind the open door, holding her breath. The footsteps stopped at the top of the hallway. Then a phone rang, and Salvatore's voice carried up, irritated, telling someone that tomorrow no one had better be late. The footsteps turned around and went back downstairs. Nora waited until she couldn't hear anything anymore, then stepped into the hallway and closed the study door behind her. Celeste was standing at the top of the stairs. The two sisters looked at each other for a stretch of time Nora couldn't measure. Celeste didn't scream. She didn't call anyone. She only stared, and there was something on her face Nora had never seen before. Something very close to fear. "You took off your glasses," Celeste said. "Yes." "In this house?" "Yes." Celeste glanced very quickly toward the staircase behind her. Nora would remember that glance for the rest of her life. Her sister wasn't afraid something had been stolen. Her sister was afraid someone might see the two of them standing side by side. Nora took one step closer and leaned in, her voice cold and steady. "I have Father's ledger, Celeste. And I have the memory card from his desk that records every meeting he's ever had. If you scream or try to stop me, I release it all, including the part about the bottle of Amaro you put in my hands on my wedding day. One shout, and you're finished before I am." "You know something?" Nora said. "Today I didn't have to put anything on my face. I only had to take off my glasses and walk through the gate." The gatekeeper nodded at me. "Marta told me I was home early. Not one person in this house has looked closely at my face even once in 10 years, because they were taught they shouldn't look." She took one step toward her sister. "But you looked. You looked every day. What are you talking about? You wanted this face so badly that you made me cover it for 10 years, Nora said. "If it were really ugly, you wouldn't have needed to do anything at all." Celeste stood still. Then something in her expression seemed to drop away, and her voice changed completely, becoming low and tired. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry?" "No." "Good," Celeste said. "Because I'd do exactly the same thing again. Do you know what I was in this house when I was 17? I was Baron's daughter, the only one. Then Father brought you home, and in a single afternoon I became half of something." She shrugged. "I only took back what was mine." "And the night of the wedding," Nora said. "Who were you taking something back from then?" Celeste didn't answer immediately. "Father was going to send me," she finally said. "I said no, and Father said then send the other girl. I didn't argue. You want me to say it plainly? There it is. I didn't argue a single word. You gave me the bottle. I gave you the bottle," Celeste said. "If they had walked in and found you standing there, it would have been over in 5 minutes, and I would still be sitting here." Nora nodded slowly. Then she walked down the stairs, passing her sister, and neither of them touched the other. Celeste didn't follow her. At the foot of the stairs, the housekeeper greeted her again. Nora walked through the side gate at 4:39 with 23 photographs and a memory card in the inside pocket of her coat. And Tommy Seraphin already had the engine running. The restaurant had been closed to customers since noon on Thursday. By 4 in the afternoon, representatives from 5 families had filled every seat around the long table in the back room, while outside, near the bar in front, another 20 or so men stood waiting. Salvatore Barone sat at the head of the table on this side because this was his house. Tommy Seraphin wheeled Adrian in at 4:10, through that exact side door, past that exact stretch of bar, and the entire room watched him for every foot of the way. Salvatore stood to greet him, one hand pressed to his chest, his voice full of sympathy. "I'm very glad you were able to make it," he said. Vincent Rourke sat near the middle of the table, and he didn't wait long. He stood as soon as everyone had settled into their seats. "I'll keep this brief," he said. "No one here wants to insult anyone. But it's been 13 months. 3 port contracts are frozen. The union won't sign with a name whose face they never see. I propose that the families vote to transfer control of the Vitali organization, and I'm willing to accept that responsibility." A murmur moved along the table. Salvatore nodded in support. A man seated at the far end asked whether Adrian wanted to say anything. Adrian placed both hands on the arms of his chair and stood up. The room went dead silent. He stood straight without holding on to anything, and he remained there until even the sound of chairs scraping backward had completely faded. "I've been walking normally for 11 months, he said. 2 people knew. Both of them work for me. I kept it quiet because I wanted to see who would start counting votes." He looked at Vincent. "You started in November. I have the dates." Vincent remained standing. "That doesn't change anything," he said. "The port is still frozen." "The port is frozen because you kept it frozen," Adrian said. He gave a small nod, and Tommy placed a folder on the table, and slid it toward the center. These are 3 meetings you told me the other side canceled. They didn't cancel. You didn't show up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hurry either. Second. A second folder was placed on the table. Last September, I entered this restaurant through the rear door. 4 people knew which entrance I would use and what time I would arrive. You were one of those 4. He looked around the table. That night, the entire building lost power for exactly 4 minutes. The utility company says there was no failure anywhere on the grid. The breaker in this restaurant was shut off by hand. Salvatore Barone began shifting uneasily in his chair. Third. Tommy set down a third folder, thicker than the first 2. 4 transfers into a trucking company in Cicero over 3 consecutive months, totaling $210,000. That company owns no trucks. It has 1 owner, and that owner is your wife's brother. Vincent was still standing. His face hadn't changed. What exactly do those papers prove? He asked. Not much, Adrian replied. Until yesterday. He placed one hand on the final folder, and instead of sliding it toward the middle of the table, he pushed it toward Salvatore Barone. Mr. Barone, you record every meeting in your study, including meetings you probably shouldn't record. There are 4 involving Mr. Rourke, and in 3 of them, he mentions someone he calls my friend in the loop. He paused. In 23 pages of your ledger, there are 7 dates and times when Mr. Rourke told you he was meeting with lawyers. Those 7 dates match 7 occasions when he entered the federal building on South Dearborn Street. My people have photographs. The room became so quiet they could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. He sold me to you, Adrian said, and he sold all of you to them. That was when everything collapsed. The man seated at the far end of the table, representing the Corradi family, stood first, and he didn't look at Vincent. He looked at Salvatore. You called this meeting, he said. This man came with your guarantee. 2 more men stood. Someone said that if the federal building part was true, then everything spoken in that room over the past 3 months had already gone outside. And if that was the case, then the Vitali family wasn't the only one in danger. Salvatore Barone managed exactly 1 sentence, that he hadn't known. And the entire table looked at him in a way Nora, had she been standing there, would have recognized immediately, because it was the same look people gave someone who no longer counted as a person. 2 men escorted Vincent Rourke out through the side door. No one drew anything. There wasn't a sound louder than chairs scraping across the wooden floor. The door closed, and that was the last time anyone in that room ever saw him. And at that exact moment, the main door near the bar opened. Nora Delaney walked in. She wasn't wearing glasses. There was nothing attached to her face. She walked past the bar, past the 20 or so men standing there, and they moved aside not because they knew who she was, but because they didn't. She walked to the far end of the back room and stopped beside Adrian. Salvatore Barone looked at her and couldn't say a word. Behind them, standing partly hidden beside the kitchen door where she had been listening for the past 20 minutes, Celeste Barone saw her own face standing beside the most powerful man in the room, beneath the lights, in front of 20 witnesses, and all of Chicago would know before sunrise. Adrian didn't introduce her. He only addressed the table in that same low voice. My wife is the person who dragged me off the floor of this restaurant last September, he said. Go ahead and vote, if anyone still wants to. No one voted. By 6 that evening, the room was empty, and by 9 o'clock, all of Chicago knew. Adrian and Nora returned to Lake Forest, and for the next 2 days his phone never stopped ringing. By Sunday afternoon, things had settled enough for the clocks in the house to be heard again. Adrian called her into his study. There was a large envelope on the desk. Sit down, he said. Nora didn't sit. He opened the envelope and laid everything out in a neat row, the way someone might arrange a hand of cards. Divorce papers, he said. I signed them during the first month. You sign in the 3 marked places. My lawyer files them this week. No dispute, and it'll be finished in 3 months. He pushed the second folder toward her. Documents for a new name. Legal, not forged. Driver's license, social security number, tax records going back 3 years. The third folder. An account in your name. Already open, already funded. You don't need anyone's permission to withdraw from it. The final folder. And this is the contract with the facility in Green Bay. Ruth Delaney's care is paid in full for the rest of her life. It doesn't depend on me, doesn't depend on you, and no one can cancel it, not even me. He straightened the folders into line again. I promised 6 months. It's only been a little over 2, but it's over now, so you don't have to wait any longer. Nora looked down at the 4 folders. You're sending me away, she said. I'm keeping my word. You're keeping your word, she repeated. You're very good at keeping your word. That's how you do this, isn't it? You don't say you don't want me. You hand me an envelope and tell yourself you're being kind. Adrian didn't answer. She walked to the desk and placed one hand on the divorce papers, but didn't pick them up. Tell me the real reason, she said. He was silent for a long time. Because I watched you spend 10 years in a house where everyone made every decision for you, he said. What you wore, what face you showed the world, who you married. Then you got out of there and walked straight into my house, still without anyone asking what you wanted, including me. He looked down at the desk. I don't have the right to become the second cage of your life. Go out there and live for a year. Then, if you still want to come back, it'll actually be your choice. Are you finished? Yes. Then it's my turn, Nora said. She pulled out the chair and sat across from him, and she spoke slowly and clearly, never raising her voice once. You pretended to be paralyzed for 11 months, she said. You sat in that chair to see who would leave and who would stay. You let an entire city laugh at you because you wanted to know who was real. She leaned forward. Now I'm staying. I stayed when you were lying on the floor at the Drake. I stayed for 2 days in that house in Kenosha. I went back to my father's house alone, without telling you, to get what you needed for Thursday. I've already passed your test, Adrian, and now you want to send me away again. Adrian opened his mouth. She raised one hand. You told me I've never been allowed to choose. You were right. Her voice grew slightly rough, but she didn't stop. When I was 4, people chose the house I would live in. When I was 17, my sister chose the face I would wear. On the morning of my wedding, my father chose me to go in my sister's place, and not one person asked me a single question in those 10 years. She placed her hand flat on the desk. I didn't choose that wedding, but I choose you. That's the first thing in my life I've ever been allowed to choose. Don't take it out of my hands. Adrian sat completely still. You told me to go out there and live for a year, she said. Fine. I'll get a job. I'll rent a place. I'll drive myself to Green Bay to visit my mother with money I earn myself. You want me to have a life that doesn't depend on you? Then I'll have one. But I'll do all of that as your wife, not as someone you walked to the door so you could feel better about letting her go. She pushed the divorce papers back toward him. You can keep these. Adrian looked down at them. He said nothing for so long that Nora could hear the wind outside the window. Then he pressed his lips together for a beat. Nora saw it. You just pressed your lips together, she said. Adrian looked up, and then he did something he had never done with anyone in the 12 years he had held that position. Something all of Chicago would refuse to believe if anyone told the story. He picked up the divorce papers with both hands, tore them in half, tore them once more, and dropped them into the wastebasket beneath the desk. Then he pushed the other 3 folders toward her. You still keep these, he said. The new name, the money, and Ruth's papers. You can leave whenever you want. I don't want you staying because you have nowhere else to go. Nora picked up the 3 folders and held them against her chest. Now that's how you ask, she said. The federal indictment was unsealed in the middle of November. Salvatore Barone was charged under the RICO Act along with 4 other men, and throughout the indictment, which ran more than 200 pages, most of the dates and times matched with remarkable precision. The 7 occasions when someone had entered the federal building on South Dearborn Street. The restaurant in the West Loop closed during the first week. By January, the court had ordered the assets frozen, and the house in Oak Brook was listed for sale. Nora never went to see it. Celeste came to the lake house one afternoon in February, taking a bus as far as Sturgeon Bay and a taxi the rest of the way. She stood at the beginning of the driveway and didn't ring the bell. She simply stood there until Nora came outside and opened the door. The woman waiting there looked nothing like anyone Nora had known during those 10 years. There was no beautiful smile, no sweet voice. I don't have anything left, Celeste said. They took everything, even my account, because it was in Father's name. Nora didn't invite her inside. The 2 women sat on the front steps, and Nora went into the house and returned with an envelope she had prepared 3 weeks earlier, when she read the news and knew this day would come. She placed it between them. There's money in there, she said. Enough for you to rent a place and live for 6 months somewhere no one knows your name. There's a bus ticket to Denver for tomorrow. You can change it to another day if you want. And your birth certificate is in there. The original. I took it from Father's study before that Thursday. Celeste looked at the envelope without touching it. Why would you do this? Because I don't want to think about you anymore, Nora said. And the only way I can stop thinking about you is knowing that you're all right somewhere very far away. She stood. You get to start over. That's more than you ever gave me. Celeste picked up the envelope. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally asked only one question. Can I write to you? No, Nora said, but live decently. That's enough. The taxi returned for her close to dusk, and Nora stood in the doorway watching until the taillights disappeared beyond the trees. It was the last time the two sisters ever saw each other. Ruth Delaney was moved permanently into the lake house that spring, with a full-time nurse staying with her, in a room whose window looked out over the water. The old woman lived another 3 months. On her final afternoon, Nora sat beside the bed holding her hand, and Ruth opened her eyes and looked at her for a long time. Nora, she said, close the window for me, sweetheart. The wind is cold. Nora stood and closed the window. When she turned back, the old woman had fallen asleep, and she never woke again. 8 months later, on a September afternoon, 11 people gathered in the yard behind the cabin by the lake. There was no church. There were no 200 guests. Tommy Seraphin was there with his wife. Dr. Helen Kessler was there. The former manager from the Green Bay facility was there. And there were a few friends Nora had made during the 5 months she had been working at the bookstore on the main street in Sturgeon Bay under the new name she had chosen for herself. Adrian Vitale stood at the end of the aisle. There was no wheelchair. No one was pushing him. He had been standing there on his own for 15 minutes. And when Nora stepped off the porch, he walked 3 steps toward her and held out his hand. She didn't have to bend down. There was nothing on her face. The officiant said a few brief words about what the two of them had promised each other before, and how they were now promising it again, and when her turn came, Nora spoke her vows. Adrian listened to every word, then leaned his head close and whispered so softly that only she could hear. Say it again. This time, she didn't say she was sorry. I choose you, she said. There are things in life we don't get to choose. We don't choose where we're born. We don't choose the family we're given. And sometimes we don't even get to choose the face other people force us to wear. But a person's dignity has never lived in a face, in a pair of legs, or in whether someone can stand up on their own. It lives in whether someone is willing to truly see us when we have nothing left to put on display, and in whether we have the courage to stand up for ourselves and choose something for our own lives. People often laugh at someone they have never taken the time to look at closely, and almost every time, the person who deserves pity is the one doing the laughing. If this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love so that we can continue sharing powerful stories about human dignity and redemption. What do you think about Nora and the choices she made? And in your own life, have you ever met someone who was treated as though they weren't worth seeing? Or have you ever been that person yourself? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, peace, and comfort every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.